Alright YouTube, it's time for Occult Literature video number 65, the Secretum Secretorum Pseudo-Aristotle work, also called the Kitab Sir al-Asrar. Originally it was written in Arabic. I know it's referred to by some as though it was actually written by Aristotle, directing it towards Alexander the Great. That is not the case. It comes centuries later. That being said, if you want a cross-section of medieval life and times, then other than the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, this is probably the other foremost work within that sort of context. In fact, this one is longer. It's about 66 pages. And it goes beyond the dietary. It goes beyond just sort of a health guide, which is what the regimen was. It goes into governance, it goes into social order, it goes into what are the seasons, what should you eat during these seasons, what is the nature of the weather during these seasons, what happens. And it's sort of just a medieval wisdom guide, really, when it gets down to it. It does delve, though, heavily into the spiritual, and that's why I've decided to release an edition of it. Now, as always, link in the description to where you can purchase an edition of this work off of Amazon. Second link for my books blog. If you're into the medieval stuff, I definitely recommend the Regimen. And it's on there under the spiritual works category on the left-hand side. You just click it. There are other works as well there of note from that period. Most of it's Renaissance, I will say that. Renaissance through Enlightenment is really sort of this golden age of occult lore. You get relatively little from the medieval era. You got to realize those people, they didn't have the printing press, and they were still writing on vellum and illuminated manuscripts by hand, so it took a little bit longer than printing things out after Gutenberg comes along. So the basic concept of this work is it's delivered in the form of letters, supposedly from Aristotle to Alexander the Great, giving him advice on how to prolong his life, medicine, governance, how to expand his empire, and so forth. And within that context, it gives us a pretty good idea about, I suppose, what some of the more enlightened minds of the era were thinking, not just in a social sense or in even a physical sense, but also in a spiritual sense. You know, praise God, be noble, be virtuous, you need to have piety. Another thing, surprisingly in here, we often think of, like, the medieval era. We think of tyrants and tin-horn despots ruling over their sort of fiefdoms, and they basically just grind people down. They rape everything in sight. They amass all the treasure. There's no nobility at all. They have all the wealth. Their peasants live in complete and utter squalor. What this recommends, though, is that the poor should be treated charitably, that they shouldn't be overtly oppressed, that they should largely be left alone, and that the king, if they want to truly rule well, needs to show liberality. Not in the sense of, like, modern neoliberalism, but in the sense of, I guess, classical liberalism. Literally recommending that schools be set up, academies and schools for training people, not taking into consideration their status of birth, for instance. It's explicitly stated, oh, well, here's a tale from India, and there was one kid here, and he was just like the son of a weaver, and so, you know, peasant, low class. But he ended up training in astronomy and science, and he became, you know, wonderful. Now he's the king of India. So the idea is that Alexander the Great, supposedly, again here, is being recommended against really putting that much stock in people's original status, but rather looking at their own attributes as a person themselves, not at their lineage, not at their ancestry. It's sort of the dissolution of the caste system when you really think about it. Oftentimes, I will say this, feudal lords were often worse than kings in those days. They were often far more abusive. They were also more physically in proximity to their population, thus the abuse was easier. Some king reigning 100 miles away. It took quite a while to go 100 miles in those days, even by ship, so back then it was a little bit different than today, where you can fly anywhere in the world in under 12 hours. But yes, it gives a great deal of dietary advice, for instance, the type of food to eat at different times, the type of wine to use. Bloodletting is frequently alluded to, as well as taking the purge, sort of making yourself vomit, I guess, to get rid of, you know, black choler or whatever, to balance the humors. The concept of the humors was still very much accepted, sort of the Galenism of the times. and they had different methods for relieving these various humors, and they thought that that was what caused disease. It also talks about sanitation, just like the regimen does. It's actually quite advanced. For that stage in human history, is probably the most enlightened work of the entire medieval era, honestly, and that's quite something. Now, again, it was written by a bunch of Muslims at the time. It's actually funny, they were the ones, for a while there, that were primarily the ones setting up schools, and which had really a more liberal social order at the time. Then, of course, fairly recently, a couple centuries before present, they sort of fall apart into this sort of tribal mentality. Now it's the Christian world or the pagan and secular world really carrying on that same tradition. But at the time, some of these groups outside of Europe really, because they hadn't devolved completely into barbarism, they were having an easier time of it. There was still sanitation available. Sort of the post-Byzantine period. Now, you're looking at basically the idea that as the Islamists advanced, they took over the Byzantine regions, and they simply maintained the infrastructure that was there. They maintained the wisdom of the books of the Byzantines, which they had compiled from various sources, and it wasn't really the Islamic Renaissance. What it was the rediscovery of pagan lore more than anything else, which the Christians had branded as heretical and forced to the sort of eastern outlands of the region, where it was tolerated for a while by the more eastern tradition than certainly the tyrants in the west. But yes, it's an extremely good work. Comes highly recommended anyone who wants to study sort of the medieval era in any form. And if you're into the occult, this does cover the rudiments of social order from a spiritual perspective. Now, it is Abrahamic perspective. The funny part is, despite the fact that it was actually written by Islamic folks, it was used by Christians openly. In the same era that these two groups were constantly butchering one another. It was used, I mean, they accepted it. They had no problem with it. They assumed that the Arabic scholars had simply returned to them something from antiquity, and they actually adapted it. It's rather funny. And if they had fully adapted this in all kingdoms, Europe never really would have had that much of a dark age at that time, because this is literally more on par with what you'd get in maybe the late Renaissance, even the early Enlightenment period, as far as how forthright it is in delivering this sort of social philosophy. Let alone, some of the medical stuff, bloodletting or whatever, that continued to be accepted, but it doesn't really do anything. But again, if you'd like a copy of this work, link in the description to the edition I've released on Amazon. Very good work, highly recommended. Second link to my books blog. If this isn't exactly your thing, maybe you want to curse people or raise demons or something like that, it's all there. King James Demonology sort of comes from centuries later, still definitely worth a read to anyone. Even if you're not really into demonology, still an excellent, very well written, logical, thought out work. So yeah, that's about all. Peace out.